Right now, you are aware. You can feel your own existence. And science has absolutely no idea how that is possible. The human brain has been studied for over a century, every neuron mapped, every chemical tracked, and yet the one thing nobody can explain is you. The question of consciousness is not new. For thousands of years, human beings have asked the same thing. What am I? Why do I exist? What is the difference between a living, feeling, experiencing person and a machine that simply processes data? Ancient Greek philosophers debated this question before science even existed. Plato believed consciousness was something eternal, something that existed beyond the physical body. Aristotle disagreed completely. He believed the mind was a function of biology and nothing more. For centuries, the debate stayed philosophical. There was no way to test it, no equipment to measure it. Then neuroscience arrived. Scientists discovered that damage to specific brain regions produced specific changes in personality and perception. The brain and the mind appeared to be the same thing. Consciousness seemed to have a physical explanation. It seemed like the mystery was almost solved. It was not. Because the deeper scientists looked, the stranger everything became. And one question refused to disappear. In 1995, a philosopher named David Chalmers stood in front of a room full of scientists and said something that stopped everyone cold. He said that science had been asking the wrong question. Scientists had been focused on explaining how the brain processes information, how it recognizes faces, how it stores memories, how it controls movement. Chalmers called these the easy problems of consciousness, not because they were simple, but because in principle, they could be solved by studying brain activity. But there was another problem, a harder one. Why does any of it feel like anything at all? A camera processes light, a computer processes data. Neither of them experiences anything, but you do. And no equation, no brain scan, no physical theory has ever explained why. Chalmers called this the hard problem of consciousness. And 30 years later, it remains completely unsolved. In 1988, Francis Crick, the man who co-discovered the structure of DNA, turned his attention to consciousness. If he had unlocked the secret of life itself, he believed he could unlock the secret of the mind. He partnered with neuroscientist Christoph Koch. Together, they spent decades searching for what they called the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain activity that produces awareness. They found real things, important things. Certain patterns of neural firing seem to correlate with conscious experience. Specific brain regions activated during awareness in consistent and measurable ways. Progress was real. But every answer produced 3 new questions. Every discovery deepened the mystery. Crick died in 2004, still searching. Koch continued for 20 more years. Then in 2023, Koch made a public bet that science would solve consciousness within 25 years. He lost that bet and publicly admitted it. So, what does science actually know? One of the most influential theories is called global workspace theory. Developed by cognitive scientist Bernard Bars, it proposes that consciousness works like a spotlight. Most brain processing happens in darkness, completely outside awareness. But when information becomes important enough, it gets broadcast across a massive network shared by multiple brain systems simultaneously. That broadcast is what you experience as conscious awareness. The theory explains a great deal. It explains why you can drive a familiar route without consciously thinking. It explains why a sudden sound grabs your attention instantly, but it does not explain why the broadcast feels like anything. Another theory called integrated information theory suggests that consciousness is not something the brain produces. It is something the universe contains. That any sufficiently complex system that processes integrated information has some degree of conscious experience, including potentially machines. Here is where the scientific community splits completely apart. In what became known as the adversarial collaboration, two competing groups of neuroscientists designed experiments together. Each group believed their theory of consciousness was correct. They agreed in advance to accept whatever the results showed. The experiments ran. The results came in. Neither theory was confirmed. Both explained some findings. Neither explained everything. The researchers who had spent decades building their theories walked away with more questions than answers. This was not a minor setback. This was a landmark moment in the history of consciousness research because it demonstrated something that most scientists are reluctant to admit. We are not close to solving this. We do not even fully agree on what solving it would look like. And the most honest researchers in the field are beginning to ask whether the current scientific framework is even capable of answering this question. Because everything you have heard so far assumes one thing, that consciousness is produced by the brain. That assumption seems obvious. It seems supported by overwhelming evidence. But a growing group of serious researchers is asking a question that makes mainstream science deeply uncomfortable. What if the brain does not produce consciousness? What if it receives it? What if consciousness is not something your brain generates, but something your brain tunes into? The way a radio receives a signal that exists independently of the radio itself, this idea is not new, and it is not fringe. Some of the most respected scientists in history have quietly entertained it. Max Planck, the father of quantum physics, wrote that consciousness must be considered fundamental, that matter is derived from consciousness, not the other way around. Eugene Wigner, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, argued that consciousness could not be explained by physical laws alone, because consciousness was what made physical laws observable in the first place. And in recent decades, a phenomenon called terminal lucidity has forced even skeptical researchers to pause. Patients with severe dementia, patients whose brains have been destroyed by disease over years, sometimes experience sudden, complete restoration of memory and personality in the hours before death. They become fully themselves. They recognize family. They hold clear conversations. And then they die, with brains more damaged than ever. Near-death experience research has added another layer that mainstream science struggles to dismiss. Thousands of documented cases exist of patients who were clinically dead with no measurable brain activity, who later reported detailed and accurate observations of their surroundings during the period of clinical death. They described conversations between doctors in adjacent rooms. They described specific instruments used during resuscitation. They described events occurring in other parts of the hospital entirely. Not guesses. Verified details. Confirmed by medical staff. If consciousness is produced entirely by brain activity, these reports should be impossible. A brain with no activity cannot produce experience, cannot form memories, cannot perceive anything. And yet, the accounts exist, thousands of them. Consistent across cultures, consistent across religions, consistent across ages. Researchers have spent decades trying to explain them away. The explanations remain incomplete. The cases keep accumulating. So what do you think consciousness actually is? A product of the brain? Something the universe contains?